Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A flight of reflection. Michelle Thompson was the epitome of grace under pressure, a woman who had shattered glass ceilings and forged her path in a world that hadn't always welcomed her with open arms. As the CEO of Aerovista Enterprises, a global leader in aviation technology, Michelle had built her empire through sheer determination, unparalleled work ethic, and an unwavering belief in her vision. Her private jet wasn't just a mode of transport, it was a sanctuary, a tangible representation of years of sacrifice, late nights, and relentless ambition. Today, however, as she prepared for another flight, Michelle felt a sense of unease she couldn't quite place. Her crisp black suit, tailored to perfection, fit her like armor, yet she felt exposed. The polished leather of her briefcase gleamed as it rested beside her, holding the carefully prepared documents for her upcoming meetings. But as she approached the sleek, white jet parked on the tarmac, something felt different. The airport staff greeted her with their usual professionalism, and the crew stood at attention, waiting for her arrival. Michelle's sharp eyes scanned the jet. It was the same aircraft she had flown in countless times, the same one that had taken her to critical board meetings, investor conferences, and moments of triumph. Yet, today, the sight of it didn't bring her the usual sense of pride. Instead, it reminded her of the increasing strain she had been feeling in recent months. For weeks, whispers had reached her ears, murmurs of dissatisfaction among her team, subtle hints that her leadership was being questioned. It wasn't outright rebellion, but a quiet undercurrent of doubt that had begun to ripple through the company. Michelle had always prided herself on her decisiveness, her ability to make tough calls and lead her team through turbulent times. But lately, she couldn't help but wonder if her laser focus on the company's goals had created a distance between her and the people who worked tirelessly to bring her vision to life. As she climbed the stairs to the jet, a member of the ground crew, a tall, clean-cut man in his mid-30s, stepped forward. His demeanor was polite, but there was a hesitation in his movements that caught Michelle's attention. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Are you sure you're on the correct flight? This is a private charter." Michelle paused, her hand resting on the smooth railing. She raised an eyebrow, her sharp gaze locking onto the man's face. "I'm aware of that," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "This is my aircraft." The man's eyes flicked to the jet and back to Michelle, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, though his tone carried a hint of disbelief. "I just needed to confirm." Michelle's lips curved into a tight smile. She was no stranger to moments like this, moments when her presence in spaces of power was met with skepticism. But today, the encounter struck a nerve. She nodded curtly and continued up the stairs, her heels clicking against the metal. Inside the cabin, the familiar luxury enveloped her. The polished mahogany panels gleamed under the soft overhead lighting, and the plush cream-colored seats invited her to sink into comfort. Michelle placed her briefcase on the seat beside her and took a moment to compose herself. She glanced out the window as the ground crew finished their preparations, her reflection staring back at her. The pilot, Captain Edwards, entered the cabin a few moments later. A seasoned professional with years of experience, he had been flying Michelle for nearly a decade. His presence was reassuring, a reminder of the countless successful flights they had completed together. "Good afternoon, Ms. Thompson," he said, his tone respectful. "We're ready for departure. We'll be cruising at 35,000 feet today, and the weather looks clear." "Thank you, Captain," Michelle replied, her voice steady. She appreciated his professionalism, but today, even his calm demeanor couldn't dispel the unease that lingered in her chest. As the engines roared to life and the jet taxied down the runway, Michelle leaned back in her seat. She closed her eyes, hoping the flight would offer her a moment of clarity. But her thoughts refused to settle. She thought of the young woman who had started this journey years ago, driven by a dream to create something meaningful. She had faced countless obstacles, systemic barriers, personal sacrifices, and moments of doubt that had threatened to derail her progress. But she had persevered, transforming challenges into opportunities and building a legacy that would outlast her. Yet now, as she soared above the clouds, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting. The murmurs of discontent within her company were growing louder in her mind, echoing doubts she had tried to suppress. Had she become too focused on results, losing sight of the people who had helped her achieve them? Had she let the weight of leadership distance her from the very team she had once inspired? The thought was unsettling. Michelle prided herself on her ability to adapt, to evolve in the face of change. But this time, the change felt different. It wasn't an external challenge she could outmaneuver, it was an internal reckoning she couldn't ignore. As the jet leveled off at cruising altitude, Michelle opened her briefcase and pulled out the agenda for her upcoming meetings. The papers were neatly organized, each page a testament to her meticulous preparation. But as she scanned the documents, her mind wandered back to the man on the tarmac. His hesitation, his unspoken doubt, mirrored the whispers she had been hearing within her company. For the first time in years, Michelle felt the sting of vulnerability. It wasn't a feeling she welcomed, but she knew it was one she needed to confront. The flight ahead would give her time to reflect, to reassess her approach and find a way to bridge the growing divide between her and her team. Unbeknownst to Michelle, this flight would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about leadership, resilience, and the power of connection. By the time she landed, she would no longer be the same woman who had boarded the jet. The weight of assumptions. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, creating a steady rhythm that usually soothed Michelle during flights. But today, the sound felt almost intrusive, like an unwelcome noise disrupting her thoughts. She leaned back into the plush leather seat, staring out the window as the clouds rushed by, their quiet serenity a stark contrast to the turbulence in her mind. Michelle Thompson was no stranger to being underestimated. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to walking into rooms where assumptions about her abilities and authority were made before she even spoke a word. Whether it was because she was a woman in a male-dominated field or a black executive at the helm of a multi-million-dollar empire, Michelle had learned to let those assumptions fuel her ambition. Her journey hadn't been easy. She had clawed her way to the top of the aviation industry, an arena where the competition was cutthroat and the challenges unrelenting. Aerovista Enterprises was her masterpiece, a global powerhouse that specialized in cutting-edge aviation technologies, private charters, and logistics. Under her leadership, the company had grown from a small startup to an industry leader, boasting international contracts and groundbreaking innovations. Yet, as Michelle sat there, staring out into the endless sky, she realized that despite all her achievements, there were still those who refused to see her for who she truly was. The brief interaction on the tarmac, though brief and subtle, was just another reminder. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you sure you're on the correct flight?" Those words replayed in her mind. They weren't aggressive or intentionally disrespectful, but they carried the weight of an unspoken narrative, one that had followed her throughout her career. It wasn't the man's words alone that bothered her, it was what they represented. Doubt. Skepticism. Assumption. She knew better than anyone that the path to leadership was never smooth, especially for someone who looked like her. Still, she couldn't help but feel frustrated. How many times would she have to prove herself before people stopped questioning her place in the world she had built? Michelle let out a deep sigh, running her hand along the polished surface of the wooden table in front of her. Her fingers brushed against the reports she had been reviewing earlier, though her focus was far from business now. It was rare for her to feel so distracted, and she didn't like it. Just as she was about to try to refocus, the door to the cockpit opened. Captain Edwards stepped out, his face calm but professional as always. "Everything all right up there?" Michelle asked, shifting slightly in her seat. "Yes, ma'am," Edwards replied with a small nod. "Clear skies ahead. Should be smooth sailing." "Good to hear," Michelle said with a faint smile. She always trusted Captain Edwards. He was one of the best in the industry, and over the years, they had developed a quiet respect for one another. Edwards had been her go-to pilot ever since Aerovista acquired its first private jet. Is there anything else you need before we settle in for the flight? Edwards asked, his voice even. Michelle shook her head. No, thank you. Carry on, Captain. As he disappeared back into the cockpit, Michelle found herself thinking about the men and women who made up her team, the pilots, engineers, ground crew, and office staff who worked tirelessly to keep AeroVista running like a well-oiled machine. For years, she had prided herself on maintaining a high standard of excellence, ensuring that every person who represented her company did so with the same level of professionalism she demanded of herself. But lately, something had begun to shift. Whispers of discontent had reached her ears, whispers that stung because they came from people she trusted. Michelle had worked hard to cultivate loyalty and respect among her team, but she had to admit that the company's rapid growth had created distance. She spent more time in boardrooms and investor meetings than on the ground with her team, and she wondered if they still saw her as one of them, or as someone who had become disconnected from the day-to-day challenges they faced. The doubts gnawed at her, no matter how much she tried to push them aside. She had always believed that leadership required focus and discipline, but she couldn't deny the possibility that her focus on results had made her rigid. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the cabin speakers, pulling her out of her thoughts. Ms. Thompson, this is your co-pilot, Jeremy. We're experiencing some slight turbulence ahead. Nothing to worry about, but we're adjusting the altitude to smooth things out. Understood, Michelle replied, her voice calm. The slight tremor in the jet's movement felt almost symbolic, an external reflection of the internal turbulence she was feeling. She took a deep breath, trying to push the unease aside, but her thoughts continued to spiral. In her years as a CEO, Michelle had learned that leadership was about balance, between confidence and humility, power and empathy, vision and adaptability. But now, for the first time, she felt like she might be losing that balance. As the turbulence settled and the cabin grew calm again, Michelle reached for her tablet and began scrolling through the notes for her meetings. Her schedule was packed, as always, investor updates, partnership negotiations, and a leadership retreat where she would address her senior staff. The retreat was particularly important. It was supposed to be an opportunity to rebuild trust, strengthen connections, and realign the team around AeroVista's goals. But deep down, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late, that the cracks were too wide to mend. She stared at the tablet screen, her thoughts drifting back to the early days of her career. Back then, she had been young, hungry, and determined to prove herself. Every small victory had been hard-won, and every setback had taught her valuable lessons. She had never allowed herself to wallow in failure or doubt. Instead, she had used those moments as fuel, pushing herself to work harder, aim higher, and dream bigger. And yet, here she was now, at the height of her success, feeling unmoored. The truth was, success came with its own challenges, challenges no one had prepared her for. The higher she climbed, the more isolated she felt. The very people she had fought so hard to inspire now seemed distant, and the whispers of doubt within her company felt like a betrayal. As the jet soared above the clouds, Michelle made a decision. Enough was enough. She couldn't continue to lead from a distance, disconnected from the very people who had helped her build AeroVista into what it was today. If she wanted to bridge the gap, she would need to confront the hard truths about herself, her leadership style, and the changes she needed to make. Her fingers hovered over her tablet as she opened a new document. She began typing, her thoughts pouring out in a stream of determination and resolve. Rebuild trust. Listen more. Be present. Lead with empathy. The words weren't groundbreaking, but they were a start. Michelle knew that real leadership wasn't just about strategy and results, it was about connection, understanding, and the ability to inspire others to believe in a shared vision. The jet's engines hummed steadily as Michelle finished her notes. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of clarity. This flight, which had begun with doubt and unease, was beginning to feel like a turning point. Little did she know, the real test was yet to come. The unexpected encounter. Michelle Thompson's mind was a whirlwind as the jet sailed smoothly through the clouds, the cabin quiet except for the low hum of the engines. The notes she had scribbled on her tablet lay in front of her, words that had taken shape as a plan to reconnect with her team and rebuild the trust she feared was slipping away. Her self-reflection was a heavy but necessary exercise. She thought back to the early years of Aerovista Enterprises when she knew every team member by name, knew their families, and understood their aspirations. Back then, her company had been small, the vision ambitious, but reachable. Now, Aerovista was a global name, and the intimacy that had once defined her leadership had been lost in the chaos of scaling up. Michelle sighed, pushing the tablet aside and rising to her feet. She walked to the small cabin galley to pour herself a glass of sparkling water. The motion, simple as it was, allowed her to stretch and regain her focus. She was determined to face the growing disconnect within her company, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something larger was at play, something she hadn't yet grasped. As she turned back toward her seat, a sudden jolt shook the jet. The glass in her hand trembled, a few drops of water spilling over her fingers. "Captain Edwards," she called toward the cockpit, her voice calm but firm. The intercom crackled to life. "Just a little rough air, Ms. Thompson. We'll climb a few thousand feet to smoother conditions." Michelle nodded to herself, reassured by the captain's confidence. Edwards was a consummate professional, he wouldn't let anything go unchecked. Still, her unease remained. She settled back into her seat, opening her briefcase again. Her eyes lingered on the neatly arranged papers, financial reports, partnership contracts, and outlines for her upcoming speech at the leadership retreat. Normally, her focus was razor-sharp during flights, but today was anything but ordinary. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of movement toward the front of the cabin. She turned her head sharply, just in time to see the cabin door open. A young flight attendant stepped through, her expression uncertain. "Ma'am," the attendant said hesitantly, her eyes darting toward the cockpit. "We're going to have a slight delay on landing. The air traffic at our destination has been backed up." Michelle studied the woman carefully, sensing there was more to the situation. "Is everything all right, miss?" "Rachel," the attendant replied quickly, managing a small smile. "Everything's fine. It's just standard procedure." Michelle nodded, though the unease in her chest grew stronger. Something felt off. She knew the rhythms of flights like this, and delays weren't uncommon, but there was a tension in Rachel's voice that wasn't easy to ignore. "Thank you, Rachel," Michelle said calmly. "Please let me know if anything changes." The young woman nodded quickly and retreated toward the galley. Michelle leaned back in her seat, tapping her fingers on the armrest as her mind wandered. The growing sense of something being amiss was hard to shake. She was not a woman who let small details pass unnoticed, her instincts had been the cornerstone of her success. And right now, her instincts were telling her that something wasn't adding up. Her thoughts were interrupted again when the sound of heavy footsteps reached her ears. She turned sharply, her brows furrowing as a man, an unfamiliar face, entered the cabin. He wasn't part of the flight crew, Michelle knew all her regular staff. This man, in his navy blazer and crisply ironed pants, exuded an air of authority that immediately put her on guard. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice low and clipped. "I'm Robert Ellis, Senior Aviation Officer." Michelle raised an eyebrow, her sharp gaze narrowing on him. "And what brings you into my cabin unannounced, Officer Ellis?" The man's posture stiffened, as if taken aback by her directness. He cleared his throat. "There was a slight miscommunication, Ms. Thompson. My team was under the impression that this flight was unauthorized." Michelle's jaw tightened. "Unauthorized," she repeated, her tone cool and controlled. "This is my private jet. My company owns this aircraft." Ellis shifted, clearly uncomfortable under her steady gaze. "It appears there's been an administrative error. I just need to confirm your identification and clarify the situation with the crew." Michelle's patience began to fray. This was not the first time she'd been questioned about her authority, and she was growing tired of these encounters. "I've flown on this jet for years," she said evenly. "You'll find all the necessary documentation in the cockpit." "Yes, well," Ellis hesitated. His tone softened, but Michelle could still detect the doubt in his voice. It's unusual, that's all. I mean no disrespect, but you don't expect to see a black woman sitting in a private jet that she owns? Michelle interjected, her words sharp but calm. The man's face reddened. That's not what I meant, Miss Thompson. Perhaps not, Michelle said, leaning forward slightly. But let's call this what it is, a blatant assumption. There was a beat of silence, the tension in the cabin palpable. Michelle wasn't one to let such moments pass without addressing them. She had spent too many years fighting to earn her place, too many years proving herself time and again in an industry that underestimated her at every turn. Tell me something, Officer Ellis, Michelle continued, her voice steady. Would you have questioned my presence here if I were a man? Or if my skin were a different color? Ellis opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. He shifted awkwardly, clearly caught off guard by her pointed questions. This jet, Michelle said firmly, rising to her feet and straightening her suit, is registered under my company, Aerovista Enterprises. I'm the CEO of that company. If you have any doubts, I suggest you check with your superiors before wasting any more of my time. Ella stammered something unintelligible before nodding quickly. I apologize, Ms. Thompson. I'll make sure everything is cleared up immediately. Michelle didn't respond. She simply held his gaze until he turned and exited the cabin, the tension leaving with him. As soon as he was gone, Michelle sank back into her seat, exhaling slowly. She had grown accustomed to moments like this, moments where her authority, her success, and her very identity were called into question. But no matter how many times it happened, it never got easier. She reached for her glass of water and took a sip, her hand steady, despite the confrontation. Moments like this only reinforced why she had worked so hard, why she refused to let anyone undermine her achievements. But beneath the surface, a different emotion lingered. Fatigue. How long would she have to keep proving herself? How many more assumptions would she need to dismantle? She was Michelle Thompson, CEO of Aerovista Enterprises, a woman who had built an empire from the ground up. And yet, for some people, that still wasn't enough. The jet flew on, cutting a path through the sky. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly into the horizon, their vastness mirroring the challenges she knew still lay ahead. But Michelle's resolve had been strengthened. The world might continue to question her, but she would never stop answering those doubts with success. She leaned back, her mind clear and focused. The unexpected encounter had been yet another reminder, there was still work to do, and she was more determined than ever to do it. The quiet storm. The cabin had grown quiet again after Robert Ellis's uncomfortable exit. Michelle sat still in her seat, her posture straight but her thoughts stormy. The subtle whine of the engines was the only sound in the spacious interior, punctuated by the occasional creak of the jet as it adjusted to altitude shifts. The confrontation lingered in her mind, not because it was unique, no, far from it, but because it had struck a deeper nerve than usual. Michelle Thompson had always been a fighter. She hadn't built Aerovista Enterprises by succumbing to doubt or external pressures. Her ascent to success was paved with victories over doubters, closed doors, and silent rooms where her voice had been dismissed. In her world, doubt was a catalyst. Assumptions were opportunities to prove the skeptics wrong. That was her armor. But today, something cracked. The armor felt heavier than before. She was tired. She stared out the window, the sky outside beginning to shift hues as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Rays of gold filtered through thin clouds, painting a scene so tranquil it almost mocked the turmoil she felt. The confrontation with Officer Ellis wasn't about paperwork or policies, it was about how the world still chose to see her, even after everything she had accomplished. Her phone buzzed softly on the armrest. Michelle turned, picking it up to see an incoming call from Jonathan Pierce, Aerovista's chief operating officer. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Jonathan, she said, her tone cool and professional. What's the update? Good afternoon, Michelle. Jonathan's voice carried the usual tone of forced calm he used when trying to hide tension. I wanted to touch base before your leadership retreat. There's been some chatter among the senior managers. Michelle's eyes narrowed. She knew where this was going. What kind of chatter? There was a beat of silence before Jonathan responded carefully. They feel you've become a bit distant. A little too focused on results, maybe? Some of the directors believe morale has taken a hit. Her jaw tightened. I see. Jonathan rushed to fill the void. Michelle, you know I have your back, but I think the team needs to see a bit more of you, not as their CEO, but as a leader they can relate to. These retreats are usually good for that. Maybe, open up a little? Open up, Michelle echoed, her tone neutral but sharp enough to make Jonathan tread more cautiously. I'm not saying change who you are, Jonathan added quickly. Just, show them you're human. They respect you, everyone does, but I think they miss the woman who used to roll up her sleeves and fight alongside them. Michelle didn't respond right away. She let Jonathan's words hang in the air like mist. It wasn't the first time she'd heard this sentiment. The whispers had started soft, but now they were coming to her directly. She could almost hear her own voice challenging her in the back of her mind. Are you becoming the very thing you swore you wouldn't be? Detached. Distant. Untouchable. I'll take it under consideration, Jonathan, Michelle replied at last. Thank you for your honesty. Of course, Jonathan said, his tone relieved. We'll see you soon. Safe flight. She ended the call, placing the phone face down on the armrest. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply as the weight of the conversation settled. It wasn't just the confrontation with Officer Ellis or the whispers of discontent, everything was snowballing into a single, heavy realization. She had been so focused on her climb to success that she hadn't realized how high she had climbed alone. Memories of the climb. As the golden sunlight flickered across her face, Michelle found herself thinking back to the early days. She was 26 when she started Aerovista, a bright-eyed young woman armed with ambition, a stack of business plans, and barely enough funding to keep the lights on. Her first office had been a shoebox-sized room above a dry cleaner's shop, where the hum of laundry machines had provided the soundtrack to her late nights. Back then, success had felt personal. Her small team was a family. They fought together, celebrated small victories, and picked each other up after setbacks. Michelle had known each of their stories. She remembered Sarah, the first hire, a single mother trying to build a better life for her son. And Mike, the mechanic who'd worked overtime for weeks to finish a critical project when the company's first major contract was on the line. Now, Aerovista employed thousands across multiple continents. The intimacy of those early days had been traded for boardrooms, stockholder meetings, and quarterly targets. It wasn't a trade she regretted. Michelle knew growth required sacrifice, but the sacrifice had come with a cost she was only now beginning to see. Her thoughts were interrupted when the cockpit door opened again, and this time it was Captain Edwards who stepped into the cabin. His face was calm, but Michelle knew him well enough to sense something behind his composed expression. Everything all right, Captain? She asked, sitting up straighter. He hesitated before replying. We've received a call from ground control. It seems there's been an official request to verify the passenger manifest again. Michelle frowned. Verify? Haven't we already settled this with Ellis? Captain Edwards nodded. Yes, ma'am, but the request came from a higher office. I wanted to let you know I'm handling it. No need for concern. She gave a small, curt nod. Thank you, Captain. As he disappeared back into the cockpit, Michelle's frustration flared again. It wasn't just the doubt or assumptions, it was the bureaucracy that seemed eager to remind her of her place at every turn. Would any other CEO be asked to verify their authority like this? Her thoughts were racing now. No, this ends here, she told herself. She had spent decades proving herself. There was no more proving to be done. What she needed now was not to fight external perceptions, but to face what was happening internally, within her company, within herself. She reached for her tablet again, but this time, her focus was crystal clear. She pulled up a blank page and began to write, her fingers tapping rapidly across the screen. A promise to the people who built this company. I started Aerovista with nothing but a dream, and it was never just my dream. It was ours, every mechanic, engineer, flight crew, and leader who helped turn that dream into a reality. Somewhere along the way, I lost touch with that truth. I became the CEO who sat too high, looked too far, and forgot to look beside me. That changes now. Leadership isn't just about results, it's about connection. It's about understanding the people you lead and trusting them to lead alongside you. I promise to be better. For all of us. She stared at the words on the screen, reading them over and over until they sank deep into her core. It wasn't a polished press release or a calculated statement, it was a raw promise, written not just to her team but to herself. Michelle set the tablet down and leaned back in her seat. The sun was dipping below the horizon now, the sky streaked with deep purple and orange hues. The quiet of the cabin no longer felt oppressive, it felt like a moment of peace, before the storm she knew she would face. The world outside saw her as a powerful CEO who owned jets and made deals. They didn't see the woman who had climbed mountains alone or the leader who now stood on the brink of change. Michelle Thompson wasn't finished, not by a long shot. For the first time in a long time, she felt ready. Grounded in purpose. As the final streaks of sunlight vanished below the horizon, leaving the sky a dusky shade of indigo, the cabin was bathed in soft artificial light. The hum of the engines remained steady, yet within Michelle, there was a different hum, a growing resolve that felt both invigorating and unfamiliar. She had been through countless challenges in her career, but this moment was different. This wasn't a corporate battle or an external negotiation. This was about reclaiming something that had quietly slipped away, her connection to her purpose and her people. The flight had been far from routine. It had started with unease, then escalated to confrontation, and now Michelle sat poised on the edge of a revelation she hadn't expected. Her internal reckoning was not complete, but it was beginning to take shape, and clarity had begun to pour in like fresh air. She glanced back at her tablet, where the raw, unfiltered promise she had written stared back at her. It was more than just words, it was a turning point. For Michelle, honesty was a double-edged sword. In leadership, truth meant facing not only the flaws of others, but also those within herself. Just then, the intercom crackled again. "Ms. Thompson, this is Captain Edwards," came the calm voice. "We're about 20 minutes out from our destination. The delay has been resolved, and we'll be on the ground shortly." "Thank you, Captain," Michelle replied, exhaling softly. She closed the tablet, setting it aside as her mind shifted focus to the task ahead. The landing and the unexpected gathering. As the private jet descended through the final layers of cloud cover, the sprawling city lights appeared below, tiny pinpricks of gold and white that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Michelle gazed at the view, momentarily entranced. Cities, much like empires, were built one step at a time. Aerovista Enterprises was no different, each light below represented the work of people like her, dreamers and doers who had refused to settle. The wheels touched the tarmac with a soft thud, followed by the familiar whir of the engines winding down. Michelle unfastened her seatbelt, bracing herself for what was to come. Her team was waiting for her at the leadership retreat, a hand-picked group of senior managers and directors who had been with her through the company's growth. She knew this meeting wouldn't be easy. There was too much to address, too much to reconcile. As the door of the jet opened and the stairs unfolded onto the runway, Michelle stepped out, her heels clicking confidently against the metal. A cool breeze brushed against her face, snapping her senses into focus. Waiting near the private hangar was Jonathan Pierce, her COO, along with a handful of executives who had arrived ahead of her. Jonathan stepped forward with a tight but genuine smile. "Welcome, Michelle," he said. "The team is ready for you inside." "Thank you, Jonathan," she replied, matching his smile. She didn't miss the subtle tension in his voice. He was loyal, but even he couldn't hide the uncertainty simmering within the company. As she walked across the runway toward the hangar-turned retreat space, her mind replayed Jonathan's earlier words. Open up. Show them you're human. It wasn't her usual style. Michelle had always been a believer in leading with authority, not vulnerability, but maybe this was the change her team needed. Facing the room. The retreat space had been transformed into a professional yet relaxed environment. Comfortable chairs had been arranged in a circular formation, and a warm glow from the overhead lighting created an intimate atmosphere. The faces around the room turned toward her as she entered, some smiling, others cautious, all waiting to see what Michelle Thompson, their formidable CEO, would say. She paused at the center of the room, her hands clasped gently in front of her. For a moment, she allowed herself to observe them. There were familiar faces: Sarah, the operations director who had been with her since the early days, Tom, the engineering lead who had revolutionized Aerovista's maintenance protocols, and even a few newer hires who had only known her as the distant figure behind the empire. They all looked to her as a leader, but for the first time in a long while, Michelle realized they also looked to her for something more: reassurance, connection, and vision. Good evening, everyone, Michelle began, her voice calm and steady. I want to thank you all for being here. I know it's been a challenging few months, and we have a lot to discuss. She paused, taking in the quiet attention of the room. For the first time in years, Michelle allowed herself to step out from behind the mask of perfection she so often wore. When I started Aerovista, I didn't build it alone. I was never alone. I had you, people who believed in what we could create and who worked tirelessly to make that vision a reality. Somewhere along the way, as this company grew, I became more focused on the results than the people creating those results. Her admission seemed to catch some of them off guard. A few exchanged glances, as if they weren't sure how to respond. Michelle took a step forward, softening her tone. I know you've felt the distance. I know some of you feel like I've lost touch with the spirit of what brought us all together in the first place. And you're not wrong. I've spent so much time looking ahead that I forgot to look beside me. I stopped listening. I stopped showing up as the leader I want to be. The room was silent, but she could feel the tension shifting. There was no longer wariness in their eyes, there was curiosity, and maybe even hope. That changes now, Michelle continued. Tonight, I want us to have a real conversation, not about quarterly reports or targets, but about this team, this company, and how we rebuild the trust that has made Aerovista great. She paused, letting her words settle. Leadership isn't about standing above others, it's about standing with them. And I want to stand with you. The silence held for a beat longer before Sarah, the operations director, broke it. Thank you, Michelle, she said, her voice quiet but steady. We needed to hear that. One by one, others began to nod, their expressions softening. The guardedness that had been lingering for months began to dissolve, replaced by something Michelle hadn't seen in a long time: belief. Reclaiming the future. That night, the retreat transformed from a stale leadership meeting into something far more meaningful. Conversations flowed naturally, walls came down, and for the first time in months, Michelle felt like she was reconnecting, not just with her team, but with her purpose. As the evening drew on, she found herself sitting with Jonathan in a quiet corner of the room. You were right, she admitted, sipping her glass of water. They needed to see me. And maybe I needed to see them, too. Jonathan smiled. Sometimes leadership isn't about being the boss. It's about being the bridge. Michelle nodded, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying begin to lift. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't need to be. What mattered now was showing up, not just as a CEO but as the kind of leader who could inspire others to dream bigger, fight harder, and believe in themselves, just as she had once believed in her own impossible dreams. Outside the window, the night sky stretched wide and endless, the stars shining brighter than before. It was fitting, Michelle thought. The sky had always been her arena, a place of endless possibility. And tonight, it felt like a fresh beginning. As she stood to join the rest of her team, Michelle Thompson knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over, and neither was she.